Hey, welcome. Today, we're diving into one of the most destructive and, frankly, complicated political forces in modern history, fascism. We're going to break down where it came from, how it actually worked, and why it's a history that still really matters today. Right, let's just start here. This quote, it really nails it. Getting our heads around fascism isn't just some academic exercise. It's about understanding a force that completely reshaped the 20th century and in some ways continues to cast a long shadow over our world. So to really get why fascism ever took hold, you have to picture the world it was born into. And it wasn't a pretty picture. We're talking about a world in absolute crisis, just completely shattered and traumatized by the First World War. I mean, it was truly a perfect storm. You had these brand new fragile democracies that just seemed paralyzed, unable to get anything done. The economy was in shambles. People's entire life savings vanished overnight because of hyperinflation. Entire nations felt deeply humiliated and angry about how the war ended. And then, hanging over everything, was this massive fear of a communist revolution sweeping across Europe. It was this chaos, this fear, that made the ground so fertile for really radical ideas. And right into that chaos steps fascism. Now, it wasn't offering complicated economic theories or long parliamentary debates. No, it offered something much, much more primal and powerful. A simple, seductive promise to make the nation strong and whole again. A promise of rebirth. The name fascism itself tells you so much. It comes from this ancient Roman symbol, the fasces. And Mussolini chose it very deliberately. I mean, think about the imagery. A single rod, you can snap it easily. But a bundle of rods bound tightly together, that's strong. It was this powerful symbol of unity, of authority, a promise to bind a broken nation together and reconnect it to the glories of the Roman Empire. But behind that simple symbol was this really complex and radical idea. Scholars have a term for it, and yeah, it's a mouthful. Palingenetic ultranationalism. But what it means is actually pretty straightforward. It's the core belief that your nation is sick, it's decaying, it's dying, and the only cure is a violent revolutionary rebirth. You have to purge everything that's weak to create a brand new, glorious future. So this wasn't just a political platform, it was more like a spiritual crusade. And what's absolutely crucial to understand is that fascism defined itself in large part by what it was against. It looked at liberalism with its focus on individual rights and saw selfish weakness. It rejected socialism and communism because all that talk about class struggle, to a fascist, that was poison that divided the nation. By making itself the mortal enemy of all these other ideas, fascism could present itself as the only real alternative, the only path to salvation. Okay, so you have this grand promise of rebirth, but how do you turn that promise into actual power? How do you go from a fringe movement to running the whole country? Well, it wasn't just one thing. It was this combination of street-level violence, clever political games, and just absolutely ruthless speed. And it's so important to get this. Neither Mussolini nor Hitler took power in a simple military coup. It was more complicated. Mussolini's famous March on Rome was mostly a giant bluff. He was handed power because the king was terrified of a civil war. Hitler, well, after his first attempt at a coup failed miserably, he switched tactics. He decided to use the rules of democracy to get into a position where he could then tear democracy down from the inside. They both just brilliantly exploited the fears and the weaknesses of the systems they were trying to overthrow. And once Hitler was in, man, he moved fast. This whole process, the Gleichschaltung, or coordination, was just a systematic demolition of German democracy. He used the Reichstag fire as the excuse to suspend basic civil rights. Then came the Enabling Act, which basically made him a dictator. A few months later, all other political parties were illegal. And by 1934, he merged the two highest offices into one, becoming the absolute Führer. In less than 2 years, democracy was completely gone. So how do you hold on to that kind of power? Well, fascist states had a pretty specific and pretty grim toolkit. You have one single party that basically is the government. You have a leader who's built up into this godlike figure. You have secret police everywhere to make sure people are terrified to speak out. You have total control over every newspaper, every radio station. And you have party thugs, the paramilitaries, to beat up anyone who gets out of line. The goal wasn't just political control, it was total control. With total control locked down at home, the fascist states could now turn their attention outward. Because that promise of national rebirth, it was never just an internal project. It was meant for the world stage. And this next step would lead to devastation on a scale humanity had never, ever seen before.
At its very core, fascist ideology demanded expansion. For them, war wasn't a failure of diplomacy. It was a good thing. It was a noble test of national strength, proof that the nation had been reborn. Mussolini dreamed of a new Roman Empire. Hitler's vision was even more catastrophic, a hunt for Lebensraum, or living space, in Eastern Europe, which would be conquered and cleared of its people to make way for Germans.
And this number? It's the horrifying endpoint of Nazi racial ideology. Their vision of a pure nation required the total elimination of anyone they considered racially inferior, and their primary target was the Jewish people. This wasn't a byproduct of the war. The systematic, industrial-scale murder of 6 million Jews in the Holocaust was a central goal of the entire Nazi project. And the Nazis' genocidal madness didn't stop there. Their twisted obsession with racial purity meant they also systematically murdered millions of others. Roma people, people with disabilities, gay men, Slavic peoples they considered subhuman, and of course, anyone who dared to oppose them politically. When you have an ideology that is built on this kind of relentless aggression, a massive war is pretty much inevitable. The invasion of Poland was just the final spark. It wasn't some isolated event. It was the direct, predictable consequence of an ideology that glorified war, and it plunged the entire planet into the deadliest conflict it has ever known. So, the war was won. The regimes were defeated. But the ideas that fueled them? Well, ideas are a lot harder to kill. Fascism left behind this deep, complicated legacy, a shadow that we are all still grappling with today. After the war, the world tried to come to terms with the horror. You had the Nuremberg trials, which established this huge precedent that leaders could be held accountable for crimes against humanity. You had new institutions like the UN created to try and stop anything like this from ever happening again. But, and this is a huge but, even while all that was happening, the ideology itself was still smoldering. You had former fascists in Italy forming new political parties determined to keep the flame alive. And that right there is why this isn't just a history lesson. It's why it matters right now, because while the exact circumstances are different, you can see echoes of this kind of politics today. The hyper-nationalism, the appeal of a strongman leader who claims he alone can fix everything, the scapegoating of minorities for all of a country's problems. The playbook has been updated, but some of the tactics can feel eerily familiar. So, in the end, we're left with this question, and it's really a question for all of us. Understanding this dark history isn't about dwelling in the past. It's about equipping ourselves to recognize the warning signs, to understand the mechanics of extremism, and to be ready to actively protect the democratic values that stand in its way. Thanks for watching.